his specialty, and it was an integral part of both armies, not just the Southern Army, but the Northern Army also. And I wanted to start off just a little bit talking about revivals in the North. The revivals in the North were not as widespread as those in the South, but they did happen. They did happen. And one of the greatest, it's funny, all these revivals had a commonality to them. One of the first revivals that happened in the Northern troops was after the Battle of First Manassas. Does anybody know what happened in that battle?
The North
they went running. I mean, they were a bedraggled group, and they went running. So after that defeat, God used that, and there was a revival in the amongst the Army of the Potomac. They had in their midst, and nobody knew this guy at the time, but he was a disseminator of religious tracts. Some of you may have heard of him. His name was Dwight L. Moody. Because he was a much younger man then, had no fame, but he was fervent in his desire. And a lot of the troops, that's the only written thing that they had, because Bibles, especially in the South, they didn't have the printing presses and all. So the troops didn't have them, but they could disseminate these tracts, gospel tracts, and the troops could be exposed to the gospel. So Abraham Lincoln is kind of an interesting character. It's still debated today whether he's a Christian or not. He often invoked Almighty God in his speeches. Often did. But to my knowledge, and I looked up 2 or 3 sources on this, he never ever attended a church service. As far as I know. So it's kind of a mystery. So, and it said that there was probably, this is just a guesstimate, maybe between 100 and 150,000 conversions in the Northern Army during the Civil War. You know, right around that number. We don't know. Nobody knows for sure. We'll know when we get to heaven. But nobody knows. But there were revivals in the Northern Army. Now, what I want to spend most of my time on is not the Northern Army, because I didn't have any relatives to fight on the Northern Army. Now, Ted might have. All you Michigan people might have. I don't know. But I had a great uncle that was killed in the Battle of Gettysburg. I think Randy had a relative that was fought in Gettysburg. He was actually killed in Gettysburg. He had 2 great uncles that lost a battle in the Battle of the Seven Pines, which was an early campaign that kept the Northern troops out of Richmond. And I had one that was fought in the Battle of Mobile Bay and was captured and sent to a northern prison camp. And the northern prison camps were just wonderful, weren't they? It was the Southern ones that were bad. No, they weren't. They weren't too good either. He died in that prison camp. He's buried now in Elmira, New York, right at the site of that prison camp. So I had relatives on both sides of my family to fight for the South. The South had a great advantage because they had 2 great Christian leaders that were very high in their army. In fact, they were at the highest point in the army. And you probably know who they are. Robert E. Lee, who was a member of the Episcopal Church, and Thomas J. Jackson, better known as Stonewall, who was a staunch Presbyterian. So they had the advantage. Early in the war, Jackson appointed a fellow by the name of J. William Jones as to the chaplaincy over the whole, or at least his army, and I think later over the whole Confederate army. Now this guy was very different, and this will show you how the denominations work together. Jackson was a Presbyterian, and this guy was a Baptist. He was a Baptist. But it's real funny how they were able to work together. And a lot of times when they would have meetings after battles and laws in the battle, they had all of the denominations would actually cooperate, and they would de-emphasize like what's the big thing that divides denominations just on the surface? Baptism. You know, Presbyterians want to sprinkle, Baptists want to dunk. Well, they really de-emphasized that because they wanted to see these troops brought to Christ. They wanted to see them brought to Christ, and that could just be handled later, after the war. They could make up their mind on that. But anyway, that was de-emphasized. There were two great periods of revival among the Southern Army, and this is where I get to the commonality. In 1862, after the Battle of Antietam, or some might call it the Battle of Sharpsburg, it was the first Southern invasion of Northern Territory. The battle actually was a draw, but tactically it was a victory for the North because the South had to withdraw. And when they withdrew, they went into winter quarters. And there was a great revival that took place. After all of that, that was the bloodiest day in American history. One day. Gettysburg was 3 days, but this was the bloodiest one day in American history. So there was great revivals that took place. And what they did, what the armies did, both armies did this. During the spring and the summer, they would fight the battles. In the winter, they would go into winter quarters. And that's where a lot of these meetings took place, in winter quarters. And they would meet, these ministers would preach. Sometimes it'd be a Presbyterian, sometimes it'd be a Baptist, sometimes it'd be Episcopal. But they would meet and have these great revival meetings. And it was not like a Billy Graham crusade. It was not. They didn't call people down front. It wasn't like that. That kind of evangelism was not known at that time. It was more like George Whitefield style evangelism, where the gospel was preached and then they looked for conversion, in the inner person. It wasn't so much of a show. It was really a solid conversion. The other time that there was a great revival outpouring was in 1863. What happened in 1863 in July? You'll know. Battle of Gettysburg. The South withdrew, and they actually withdrew. It's very odd. When they withdrew, they came back down to Virginia, and they withdrew to Montpelier. Does anybody know what Montpelier is?
Vermont.
No. Virginia. Somebody had it. James Madison's. That was his home in Virginia. They withdrew to his property and just spent the winter there. And they had a lot of camp meetings there. So they withdrew to those winter quarters. And they had very rudimentary conditions. A lot of times they would just chop down trees and just lay the trees down side by side, and that would be their pews. That would be their pews. And they said that the hymns that were sung were amazing. You imagine a whole army of men singing hymns, and they said it would just reverberate through the woods, through the hills, just reverberate with all of these voices. So just a thrilling time, and mostly a cappella. There was very little musical accompaniment to it. And like I said, the differences of the denominations were kind of put aside during this time. Why did you have this revival? Why do you think? It's pretty simple.
Your mortality became very...
Yeah, absolutely. Death was a common companion. Death was a common... It could be just hale and hearty and fit 1 minute, and the next minute, gone. And not only from battle, but also disease. That disease was really, it ravaged north and the south, actually. All kinds of different diseases, infections. The surgeons would after they sawed off the limb, they would just take a cloth and just wipe the blade clean and go to the next one. So you can imagine what kind of infection was spread through that. So death was a common companion to them. So I want to read, my time is really up, and I didn't want to take more time, I really don't. But they faced death all the time, and they saw that an eternity was what was important. There was a Southern soldier, and he was actually featured in this, if you looked at the PBS special that I talked about, Ken Burns, he was actually featured because he kept a diary. And he was in the West. He was in the Army of Tennessee. And he was in the West, but he kept a diary. And Ken Burns quoted him quite often, but he didn't bring this quote. Ken Burns didn't bring this quote. But this is what he said. after he saw, after a battle, he saw some of his comrades, he saw some of his comrades just meet their death. Young people, 18, 19, 20 years old. I will try to get through this. He said, we meet no more on earth, but up yonder, beyond the sunset and the night, away beyond the clouds, the tempest, away beyond the stars that ever twinkle and shine, in the blue vault above us, away yonder by the great white throne and by the river of life, where the Almighty and eternal God sits, surrounded by the angels, archangels, and the redeemed of the earth, we will meet again.
Thank you, brother.
You mentioned some Baptists and Presbyterians. I don't know how many great grandfather J.J. Hyman that was a Methodist chaplain in the South, of course, the South. But so many of my relatives were killed, and so thanks for that, Phil. I don't see my task tonight as just recreating Jesus' family tree, or else I would have wrote it on the board there. But and I don't want to just rehash all the common stories that I think most of us are very familiar with. But as we go through and talk about some of the relatives of Jesus, and really like categories of relatives of Jesus, I want to try to point out some things that might be of relevance, application to us. And as I've studied this, it was, I have to confess, I've surfed all the way to the end of the internet, researching this, and I looked at a lot of Catholic sites. I looked at a lot of sites, but as I searched for this, I did find a lot of interesting information. But unfortunately, this is a test of our age group here. It was a lot like Artie Johnson of Laugh-In fame. A lot of it was very interesting, but stupid. So, unfortunately, I'm going to have to point out some stupid things that we're going to run across tonight. But I also want to point out some things that are of interest, and things that maybe need some more study, things that might be edifying and worthwhile. So, hopefully, as we go along, I'll point some of these things out. I do want to point out about 2 or 3 things up front before we get into this. And one is, it does not take long when you're looking at this topic, or when you're even just reading the Bible, to realize that the gospel accounts de-emphasize the physical family of Jesus. I mean, we all know from the time he was 12 until the time he became public, there's just a gap there. We don't really know anything. It doesn't take long to realize that there's a lot of common names. I'm not going to really ask, it's just rhetorical, but how many Marys are there? How many James are there? How many variations of Judah, Judas, Jude are there? We're going to run into some of this. And it doesn't take long to realize that there's a lot of trickery and a lot of confusion going on this topic. So anyway, let's begin. Let's begin with Mary. Obviously, Mary's the place to start. And I might bring out some things that you think, well, why do you say that instead of this? Or why didn't he mention this? Like I said, I don't want to just rehash the common things that we all know. So Mary and Joseph were of the house of David, of the tribe of Judah, descendants of Abraham. That's important. It's important because it fulfills prophecy, and it gave Jesus the qualifications that he needed to assume some of the offices that he had. I've been debating all along whether I'm going to get into the genealogies in Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3, just ever so briefly. It doesn't take a microscope to realize that there's some differences in them. Most people say that the differences are to be accounted for because Matthew traced Joseph and Luke traced Mary. And that very well may be true. But there's another explanation for it, and that is that Matthew, being a traditional Jew, he used the Jewish royal legal way of doing genealogy. And Luke, being a doctor and a Gentile, he used the bloodline. So, it may be a combination of the two. It may be, Luke was doing Mary and Matthew was doing Joseph. But anyway, it doesn't matter. What matters is that both methods are accurate and the information that we have is true. And it accomplished the purpose for which each of them set out their genealogy, and that was to demonstrate that Jesus was who the Bible predicted that he would be, and he was who he needed to be in order to assume some of the roles that he did. Anyway, back to Mary. Contrary to a lot of the research I did, and contrary to public opinion out there, Mary did not have a perpetual halo that had the sunbeams, radiating from it. It's funny. It's anachronistic, but all the early photographs that they were photoshopped. But anyway, she did not have this perpetual halo, and she was not a perpetual virgin. But we don't need to just shove that into the other room there. We need to pause for just a minute and realize that over 2 billion people on this planet right now believe that. That's about 1/4 of the population. So we need to, take it seriously and not just say, oh, that's, very interesting but stupid. Where that engages us, I don't know if you have any Catholic friends. I don't know if you have any Catholic coworkers. I don't know when or where this might come up. But instead of just clashing and arguing, we need to inform them that they have a wrong view of holiness. I'm not going to get into all the Plato and Gnosticism and asceticism and everything that led to this, but in the nutshell, the wrong view that they had was that the human body was bad, that sex was bad, it was not holy. So that's why they had to maintain Mary as a virgin, because the human body is bad, sex is bad. And that's an area that we need to teach more. That's an area where we need to teach them the sanctity of marriage and the sanctity of sex and the gift that God gave to his people. And, just all the wholesome, healthy things that we need to teach about sex. And if you do, engage a little bit in an argument, the perpetual virgin myth is relatively easy to deal with. On a common sense level, you can ask people, now if she had taken this vow of chastity, which they teach, before we even encounter her in the Bible, then why was she already engaged to Joseph? In just a minute, we're going to come up with one of the really, really, really stupid things in the answer to that. But then if you really want to turn to the Bible, turn to Matthew chapter 1:18. It says she conceived Jesus before she came to be with Joseph. Matthew 1:25 says Joseph did not know Mary, and we all know that means sexually, until after Jesus was born. Luke 2:7 says Jesus was her firstborn. So if there's a firstborn, there obviously has to be at least a secondborn. We'll know more details later, but to say somebody was a firstborn implies that there's going to be more. And then, as we'll discuss a little bit later on, the Bible names 4 brothers and mentions all his sisters. We'll get into that in just a second. But I've been talking for a few minutes here. I don't want to lose anybody's attention. I know these talks can be a little bit late. the chair starts getting a little uncomfortable or whatever. So let's play a very brief game show. Got a good studio audience here, and the name of this game show is Very Interesting but Stupid. And I'm going to list 3 accepted historical explanations of who Mary and Joseph's children were in relation to her. And I'm going to get y'all to raise your hand at a correct moment. Raise your hand at the one that you pick. So let me just mention them, and then I'll get you to vote. Here are the 3 most common views of who these children were. Are you a Epiphanian? Are you a Helvidian? Or are you a Hieronymian? Okay, now's the time. Get your clicker. Vote. Who's in favor of Epiphanian? Come on. Nobody?
Nobody likes that.
Just Google those words.
Helvidian?
Sure, we'll go with that.
All right, Helvidian. Yeah, good. We actually got participants here. Okay. Hieronymian.
Oh, that's definitely.
Let's see. No kidding.
Well, let me tell you what you just voted for.
Oh, dear.
Epiphanian. This is really stupid. Joseph was an 80-something-year-old widow before he married Mary, and he already had all these other children. So the children are Joseph's from a previous marriage. That's the Epiphanian.
Okay.
The Helvidian is the correct view.
Wow.
Mary gave birth to these other children with Joseph. The Hieronymian is stupid. It's this man named Clopas, which we're going to run into a little bit later, had a wife named Mary, and they had children with the exact same names as Mary and Joseph, so they were cousins. Clopas was either Mary's brother or Joseph's brother. They can't decide which, but anyway, they were not Mary's children. So anyway, let's talk about something more important. Let's talk about Mary's character and her relationship with Jesus. Mary is introduced to us in the Bible as someone who's humble and who is righteous and obedient. She's that's the way the Bible presents her, and I'm just going to tick off a few things about her. She knew from the angel Gabriel, from her relative Elizabeth, from Simeon, from Anna. She knew some facts that were said about her son Jesus, so she knew that he was special, and she knew that he was to be a savior of some sort. She, along with Joseph, raised Jesus well. Most of us are familiar with the verse in Luke 2:51 and 52 that says Jesus grew in wisdom and stature for men and God. They provided the godly home for him to be raised in. And another common verse that we all know is that she treasured these things in her heart. Now, can you imagine having Jesus as a son, especially you moms, maybe grandmoms, but moms? Jesus, did you eat your vegetables? Yes, ma'am. I really like the way you did those steamed cabbage. That was delicious. Jesus, time for bed. Yes, ma'am. I want to make sure I get a good night's sleep so I can wake up early and pray. It's hard for us to even imagine a perfectly obedient child. How many of you had even a halfway obedient child? I can tell by the snickers that most kids were at least somewhat similar to me. But here's the point I want to get to, and I'm going to make it here, I'm going to make it again with Joseph, I'm going to make it again, and I'm going to make it again. Even though she knew some things about Jesus, even though she treasured these things in her heart, she still did not really understand from a spiritual perspective what was going on. Jesus, and I'm going to use the King James word here because it just sounds so cool. Jesus had to rebuff her when he was 12. You know, the scene where he'd gone to the temple and they didn't know where he was. And then when they got reconnected, he had to politely, rebuff her. He did so again at the wedding at Cana, very politely. He didn't insinuate that there was anything evil or wrong or bad about what she did or said, but he had to rebuff her. Just kind of tell her that she didn't understand things correctly. She was not on the right wavelength. I do want somebody to turn to Matthew 12, verses 46 through 50. This is going to be kind of almost like our main passage we're going to talk about. But whoever gets to Matthew 12, 46 through 50, this is where there are other incidents where Jesus had some tension with his family, but this is one of the clearest and one of the most important, where Jesus he began to emphasize that a physical relationship with him did not impart any spiritual blessing. So whoever's got that, read Matthew 12, 46 through 50.
Jesus was still talking to the crowd. His mother and brothers stood outside wanting to speak to him. Someone told him, "Your mother and brothers are standing outside wanting to speak to you." He replied to him, "Who is my mother and who are my brothers?" Pointing to his disciples, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother."
Okay, so that speaks for itself. Jesus let that be known clearly and in public, in front of everybody. They said, "Your mother and your brothers and sisters are here." And he said, "Who's my mother? Who's my brother?" We're going to keep talking about that some more. But I don't want you to worry and think that, is Mike saying that Mary is not going to be in heaven? She wasn't a Christian? No. Later on, she was at the cross. Later on, she waited in the upper room with the disciples. There's plenty of evidence to show that she was a faithful woman. So it's not that. It's just that, what can we expect? They were not regenerated. They were not born again when Jesus was in their family. So they did not understand. As we go along, we're going to understand that regeneration is necessary to understand these spiritual things. So let's move on to Joseph. Joseph was clearly not the biological father of Jesus. We all know that. But he was universally accepted as being the earthly father of Jesus. And the Bible introduces him much the same way as it introduced Mary, as a righteous man. In fact, if you go through all the evidence in the Gospels, you're going to see that really the only thing that is demonstrated about Joseph is that he was quickly obedient. Every event in his life, everything that's recorded, he was quickly obedient. He quickly obeyed the angel when he said to Mary, Mary. He obeyed the emperor and went to Bethlehem to go to the census. He obeyed the Levitical law to circumcise Jesus. He obeyed a little bit later when he presented Jesus at the temple. He obeyed when the angel told him to flee to Egypt. He obeyed when later on he said, "Now go back to Nazareth." So we see that he was quickly obedient. We see that he was a righteous man. And like Mary, he was a good spouse. He was a good father. The same verse applies to their household for Joseph as it does to Mary. They provided a nurturing environment for Jesus to grow in wisdom and stature. But, let me just take a second here and say the only other thing that is mentioned about Joseph is that he was a carpenter. And that he definitely trained Jesus to be a carpenter, because Mark 6:3 calls Jesus a carpenter. So again, I'm going to ask, can you imagine working alongside Jesus? We don't know whether they built houses or furniture or whatever they built. But, forget Chippendale, forget, Broy Hill, forget whatever. This was made by Jesus. Can you imagine going to Antique Roadshow? If you had the provenance, this was made by Jesus. How wonderful that would be. But Jesus also had to rebuff Joseph. At the same event at the temple when he was 12, Jesus, I'm not going to look it up, we all know the quote, but Jesus said, "Didn't you know that I had to be in my Father's house?" Very politely, he was saying clearly, "Joseph, you're not my father." And that's the last that we see of Joseph. He's mentioned in other passages, but that's the last that he actually was physically present. But, again, and this is not important, but taking into account how many children they had, and taking into account that he did train Jesus to be a carpenter, he more than likely lived, we don't know, but, 5, 6, 10 more years to have all those children and to train Jesus. So, but anyway, the Bible doesn't say that's the last we see of Joseph. He's not Jesus' father. So that's where we're left with that. Before we move on to the siblings, I want to briefly talk about some of the others. Somebody comes to mind probably quite quickly, and that's Elizabeth. Most of the chapter 1 of Luke is about Elizabeth, and we glean 3 things from that. We glean that she was a Levite. We glean that she was well along in years, whatever that means. What do y'all think?
Very old.
40, 50, 40, 50. Okay. And that she was a relative of Mary. Because of the King James, the typical relationship people think of is that they were cousins. But these 3 mitigating factors, the fact that she was a Levite and Mary was from the tribe of Judah, the age difference, it kind of makes us think that the relationship might have been more like an aunt. Or, I don't know the technicalities of all the, cousins and stuff, but she was not a close cousin. She was probably a little bit distant. But the other mitigating factor is that Mary visited her during her pregnancy and helped her. So that kind of implies that there was some type of relationship. There was some, at least close enough that Mary would do that. I think it's a good testimony on Mary's part that she was humble and obedient to do that. But anyway, basically that means that John the Baptist and Jesus were related. But again, the word cousin is not necessarily accurate unless you go into all this stuff that I have never understood. Third cousin twice removed. I have no idea what any of that means. But they were not first cousins. They were not that close. They were a relatively distant relationship. And that physical relationship never came up in any of their interaction, unless you count when John leaped for joy when Mary and Elizabeth were there in the same room. So now, this is a little tough part of the program tonight. You could spend a lot of time and a lot of energy, and personally I think it would be wasted time and wasted energy, but looking up and thinking about other possible relationships. And I'll just tell you right up front, an ironclad harmony of all the evidence is not 100% provable. You cannot trust the Apocrypha, you cannot trust the Pseudepigrapha, you cannot trust the early church fathers. It's amazing, we talked about at the men's lunch, that the early church fathers, we go to them and say, yeah, see, he said this and he said that. Ooh, they also said a lot of crazy things too. And they're the source of a lot of this Mary Virgin myth. So you got to be careful when you go to these extra biblical sources. But I don't want to add to the confusion. I don't want to waste our time. So I want us to play another game show.
Oh, goody.
So this game show is called 3 or 4? Real simple. All you have to do, contestants, wonderful audience we have here, all you have to do is say whether you think it's 3 or 4. I'm going to read a verse. I'm going to read it a certain way. I'm not going to tell you where the verse is because I don't want you looking it up and looking at your study notes. But I'm going to read a verse and then I want you to vote 3 or 4. Now there were standing near the cross of Jesus his mother's sister Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. How many people were there? 3 or 4? How many vote for 3? How many vote for 4?
There you go.
Okay. We're going to go to commercial and we'll come back. We're going to come back with the answer just a little bit later. But you can see, and I'm not going to go through all the details because I would have to write them on the board, but you can see pretty clearly, I will just do it with some intonation here. Now there were standing near the cross Jesus, his mother, and then this is where his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene.
So they're
Or Jesus, his mother's sister Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. Or Jesus, his mother's sister Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene.
Well,
So-
it's very interesting because Mary's father was very unmatched.
Sister-in-law.
Commas
So
are
Clopas was
very,
her brother.
commas are important things.
We're going to take a commercial break and get back to the answer. But that's just the one verse. And by the way, it's at the end of John. It's in John 19. But the other difficulty is we've got to harmonize that verse with the other gospel accounts that have a little bit different wording. So you see the problem with harmonizing that. And I suggest that could be a good future topic for another Wednesday. But anyway, I said I didn't want to waste time, but we've done 2 game shows and wasted some time. But I do have to tell you this. While I was studying this, and you got to remember I said that I surfed all the way to the end of the internet to do this. And as I was looking at things, I would read one article and I would say, I don't know what that meant. And I would read another article and I would say, I don't know what that author was thinking. And I'd read another article and I'd say, I don't know what that means. And as I kept going, I just shortened my thought to, I don't know what. And each time I read something, I just said, I don't know what. I don't know what. I don't know what. And then it occurred to me, if I come tonight and stand here and just say, I don't know what, I'm going to sound kind of stupid. But then my high school French came back to me, and, to say I don't know what in English sounds kind of dumb. I don't know what. But to say it in French is very sophisticated. Je ne sais quoi. So I feel like, these other relatives of Jesus they have this je ne sais quoi. It's sophisticated. It's cool. Doesn't sound nearly as dumb as I don't know what. But anyway, back to planet Earth, back to reality. I do want to warn you again, if you are interested in this, do be careful. You can't trust things, we've all seen on TV, cable TV, these networks that say, the hidden relationships of the Bible revealed. These kind of things. Run, turn the channel, do anything else except watch that. Now the commercial break's over. We're back to our game show. I'll give you the answers. And I'm still a little bit uncomfortable doing this because it's not crystal clear. But I think it's reasonably likely that Mary had a sister named Salome. Salome was married to Zebedee. They had James and John. So it is reasonably likely that Jesus was first cousins with James and John. But I don't think it's very likely that there was this man named Clopas who had a wife named Mary and sons with the exact same names as Jesus' brother, and he happened to be Mary's brother or possibly Joseph's brother. I don't think that's very likely. So, going back to the original game show question, 3 or 4? I think the answer is 4. That there were Jesus' mother, his sister, Salome, the wife of Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. So, but take that for what it's worth. Now that I've cleared all that up, let's go to the siblings. They're listed in Matthew 13:55 and Mark 6:3. We're introduced to James, Joseph, Simon, Judas, who's also called Jude, and all his sisters. All implies what? It had to be at least more than 2. Because if it was 2, it would have said both his sisters. But we don't know if it was 3 or 4. We don't know exactly how many. But again, you think about what was normal back then. You think what would have been a normal family, fitting in the timeline and everything else. It was perfectly normal for Mary and Joseph to have 7, 8, 9 kids. Perfectly normal. A lot of this other confusion, a lot of this other trickery is with the intent of keeping Mary's virginity. Oh no, all those kids, they were from Clopas. Or all those kids, they were from Joseph's previous marriage. But anyway, in addition to the verses that we read about Mary and the family, it said, Jesus said, "Who's my mother? Who are my brothers?" There are other verses that indicate that there was tension between him and his family. I'm not going to look at many of them, or in fact, just one. John 7, verse 5, flatly says, his brothers did not believe in him. But I don't want you to think that they were adversarial like the Jewish leaders, that they weren't, radically opposed to Jesus. They weren't like fighting against him. When you read all the accounts, it was really more like they were protective of him. They didn't understand what he was doing. They didn't understand, the spiritual nature of it. So they wanted to protect him. That's more the feeling that you get. But nevertheless, they were acting in ignorance and unbelief, which is exactly what you would expect from people that were just natural, not born again, not regenerated people at this point. So, again, we see the physical being de-emphasized and the spiritual being emphasized. The only sibling that we know much about is James. He was probably very, very, very likely the eldest of the brothers. 1 Corinthians 15 states that the resurrected Christ appeared to James, and we don't know anything about that meeting, but we do know that after that, James was a staunch believer, and he had incredible authority in the early church. I'm not going to quote the verses, but and he also wrote the epistle with the name James. The overall character of the book of James, and I'm glad the women are going to be studying this, the overall character of the book of James is very copacetic with somebody who grew up with Jesus. Can you even imagine growing up as the younger brother of Jesus? I'm sure it cut both ways. I'm sure, we all remember somewhat early childhood experiences. Who took the cookies? James had know where to go. Because Mary would say, now James, you know Jesus didn't take the Jesus is perfect. Who broke the lamp? Now James, you know Jesus didn't break the lamp. You see.
He was the light of the world himself.
But at the same time, and on the other hand, what a privilege it was to grow up under the tutelage of Jesus. And when James did become regenerated, all of that knowledge that was caught rather than taught came out of James, and you can see it. Kind of wish I could go to the James Bible study, but anyway, James is one of the best.
Yeah, you can watch it.
Well, okay.
If she doesn't come to my house,
If I
you
get a
can watch
special
it.
invitation, okay, I'll pretend that I'm filming it or something.
Okay.
Whatever. The only other person that we know really anything about is Jude. Jude wrote that tiny little letter that's tucked in right before Revelation at the very end of the Bible. And he was comfortable identifying himself as the brother of James. He didn't call himself the brother of Jesus. He called himself the servant of Jesus. Again, just reiterating that theme that I've had going through the whole thing is that, they did not deem a physical relationship with Jesus to be something important. They saw their need, certainly, in later time. We don't have too many details, but we know from Mary's example, we know from James' example, we know from Jude's example, that there had to be a change. There had to be a regenerating experience for them. And then, so when it comes to all the rest, I'll just say this. They had a certain je ne sais quoi. I don't know and we don't know. Time's about up, but I do want to give a little conclusion. And I want to say, what do we gain from any of this? Please don't say je ne sais quoi. I think we gain what Pastor spoke about on Sunday. John 1:12-13. Can you quote it?
Let's see. We're born not of the flesh, nor of the will of man. Well, that was the third one. I missed the second one. But born of God. I missed one.
Yeah, but we get the idea. It's not by the flesh. It's by the will of God. And I can stand here before you today and say that I'm a brother of Jesus. Nothing I did. It's by the will of God. And I want to close with yet another game show. And this game show is called Who's Your Brother? And I'm going to give a little factoid, and then I'm going to ask the question, who's your brother? Who's your brother that came to this world as a servant to take on your sin and die in your place so that his father would be pleased to adopt you into his family? Who's your brother?
Jesus. Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, questions are free, answers are $20.
Good try.